good afternoon, everybody. Some suitably stirring music to kick us off this conversation. Welcome to our lunchtime thinking today. And what we're looking at in particular is women at work. And in light of the last couple of years and the new ways of working that we've all discovered post-pandemic, what is it that it's going to take to sort of retain and support women in work? And are we going to see what's been coined as the Great Resignation continue, slow, accelerate? All of these are up for debate. If you haven't been to a thinking before, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. We've got two brilliant experts with us today. We've got Emma Codd, who is from Deloitte, and she's their global inclusion lead. And I think one of the reasons we're delighted to have Emma here today is because when it comes to creating cultures at work, she's actually done it in practice. So there's a lot of theorizing about it, but it'd be really interesting to hear her views on how they've actually delivered some of this change at Deloitte. And we're also delighted that Dr. Vinika Rao is joining us from INSEAD, based out in Singapore. Hi. And what we're going to do is just do a little bit of scene setting, draw Emma and Vinika in with their views, then open up the conversation to everybody who's involved. If you've been living under a rock and don't know how Zoom works, let me just give you a quick refresher. If you've got something to say, we've got two ways of joining in today. The first is you can just go down to the reactions button and raise your hand if there's a point you'd like to make. Or my colleague Lizzie gives a wave, there's Lizzie, is going to be running the online chat. And feel free to put contributions in there, put a point. If you'd like to make it, Lizzie might come to you and say, you're happy to make that point on camera. If you're not, that's fine. We can just sort of paraphrase it and bring it into the conversation. But the whole point about thinking is that what we don't want to do is spend the whole time kind of going, God, this is just terrible, isn't it? Because some of the stats aren't that great, to be honest. What we want to do in the thinking is come out of it feeling like we understand what works, what changes things, what drives a culture that is more supportive and sustainable for women at work. So please bring your experiences, personal, within your own organisation, within your own family, actually, over the last couple of years. Have things shifted? Have you seen the balance of caring responsibilities change? And do you think that's something that's likely to stay? So I'm going to kick off. Feel free to join in at any point, and we'll try to end dead on the hour too. I'm just going to pull the lens right back on this a little bit, because I think we can get straight into the issue. But I was thinking before this thinking that we sometimes lose sight of why it's really important to have workplaces that support everybody. And today we happen to be looking through the lens of women particularly. So, please excuse the fact we're not going to cover all the other ways in which workplaces need to be supportive. But the issue with women is I found some stats, and I'm conscious this just applies to the UK, but 49% of the workforce in the UK is now made up of women. We've got a global kind of backdrop to why we need a healthy, productive, sustainable workforce. We've got an aging population challenge. There was a stat I read this morning: in 23 countries by 2100 will see their populations halve. Now, that has a great impact, obviously, on climate change, but when you've got an aging population supported by a shrinking younger labour force, that doesn't look so great. So losing women from the workforce is not just detrimental to them personally, by becoming economically no longer viable economically, no longer financially independent, so on and so forth. But actually, it poses a real challenge to how we deliver sustainable and productive growth on a global scale. So let's just pull back from that, and let's not ignore the elephant, or probably not the elephant in the room. We all know it, that women combine their work responsibilities with just a huge load of other unpaid responsibilities. In fact, some statistics have shown that, or some research showed that the kind of economic equivalent of women's unpaid labor is $10 trillion. That would make it the fourth largest economy in the world. So this is the backdrop. This is the world in which women are operating. And we've got to acknowledge all of the wider issues to be able to drill down into, right, what are we seeing happening for women at work? And what do we see organizations do that makes it much more viable, much easier, much more realistic for women to stay on their career paths throughout their careers rather than come off and struggle to get back on them. With that in mind, we've been lucky enough to get sight, and I think some of the slides that we showed just at the start of thinking highlighted some of the research that Deloitte have produced from their Women at Work survey, which is a survey of 5,000 women globally, which has thrown up some really sort of fascinating, some positive, some not so positive statistics about how women are really finding work for them at the moment. And Emma, I just, Lucy, I see you missed the slides. Yeah, we can certainly sort of send those around, or maybe pop a link in, Lizzie, into the chat if people miss them. Great, thanks. Emma, can I come to you first? I mean, for those people who haven't had sight of the full report, can you just give us a sort of edited highlights of some of the statistics that jumped out for you?
Yes, I'm happy to. I've lived this report for the last few weeks, and actually we did the same piece of research a year ago, so that was the first time we ran it. What I do want to do is emphasise the purpose of the report. It wasn't a report specifically looking at the impact of the pandemic on women. It was really, the aim was to try and better understand women's everyday experiences in the workplace. So yes, policy, and hopefully many employers have the right policies, or all do. It was actually, how do they work in practice, and actually to hear from the women themselves. So that's just a backdrop to it. In terms of the findings, look, compared to last year, I had expected to see some things improve, and we did see some slight improvements in terms of how these women were feeling. So we did see a slight bettering of work-life balance, slight increase in job satisfaction and motivation, but then we saw really concerning a really concerning picture. So, and just a very brief snapshot. So burnout, around half the women we spoke to said they currently are feeling burnt out. Mental health rated as poor, stress and anxiety on the up, and always on culture, which I know many of us may have sort of started to think was just associated with the pandemic when we were all locked down. No, it's not. It's still prevalent and it's still there. And then this burnout, I think you showed in your stats at the start, it's actually driving many women to look for new employment. So, you know, woe betide any employer that thinks this is all about money. Absolutely, money is really important. Fair pay is really important, and that's got to be got right. But actually, this is burnout, and it's considerably, you know, the highest reason at the moment that women are looking for new employment opportunities. You saw the pictures, the picture in the stat earlier about retention. Around half are planning to stay with their employer beyond 2 years, and by the time you get to 5 years, it's 10%. And then just the other couple of points that I wanted to make before we sort of move on, really important ones. Flexible working. We have been banging on about flexible working for years. We've all been trying to make flexible working work. And I mean, I've lost count of how many years we've talked about it, and not just from a women's perspective, but actually from all genders. And it's still not working. So, you know, you've got over 90% of women think they're going to suffer career impact if they want to work flexibly. And then that age-old issue of workload not being reduced if they reduce their hours. So guess what? They're not doing it. And the final point I wanted to make, we asked women, what is it that you think would lead to, you know, gender equality in your workplace? And the top answer by a long way was really very simple, but so many people don't seem to be doing it, which was embed a truly respectful and inclusive culture in your workplace. And yet, guess what? The survey found that non-inclusive behaviours are still happening. And then, you know, finally on hybrid working, not a good picture in terms of how women are feeling when it comes to exclusion and access to sponsors. So look, Tessa, as you said, it's a worrying picture. Later on, we can talk about some of the interesting stats we got about how this can change.
And it's such a confusing picture in some ways, isn't it, Emma? Because, you know, there's such a demand for flexible working, yet such a fear of asking for it. And also, the only place I spotted that we're seeing a widening in the gender pay gap is in part-time work. So it's it feels like it's a sort of careful what you wish for situation as it stands at the moment, unless cultures really adapt to flexible working properly. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's about, it's something I tackled many years ago in Deloitte in the UK, where we did have a cultural challenge when it came to flexible, what we then renamed agile working. And I know in other thinkings we've had this whole conversation about it can't just be about a name, but actually that was really important to us, was the connotation associated with that word flexible working. I saw it as a good thing. Many colleagues didn't see it as a good thing, and you instantly go into it with a bias. And then, we then see that issue around managers and leaders empowering it. And it's hardly surprising. People are saying, actually, I'm not going to ask for this because I've seen what happens. Why would I do it? And then that point about reduced workload, Tessa, is really important.
Yeah.
I have far too many friends that have reduced their hours and are still working exactly the same amount. And what it comes down to is the way you're led and the environment you're in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Emma, we are going to be coming back to you lots, so stand by your bed. But Vinika, or Dr. Vinika Rao, as I should address you properly, you've examined God knows how many organizations from this perspective. In your experience, and I wanted to come back at some point to the brilliant phrase you used when we were chatting about a career lattice rather than a ladder, which has really resonated with me, about sort of recognizing, the kind of trajectory of many careers is not a sort of straight vertical; it's a lattice. If you take where we are now and what you've seen over your career and during your research, do you think the pandemic in time will accelerate progress for women, or do you think hybrid is a structure that is sort of fundamentally going to lock in some of these disadvantages?
Thank you. And Tessa, please call me Vinika. That's my name's long enough without having to add something in front of it. But I did really enjoy, Emma's synopsis of the Deloitte report, and I read it yesterday, and it was very insightful. And actually, it does fit in with some of the things that we've been, researching and finding out, and also listening to people tell us about. So, in terms of what we've seen with the pandemic and the impact that it's had on gender balance, I mean, now there's research out on this to show that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted minorities, and among them certainly women. And if sort of committed action is not taken by policymakers, by organizational leaders, and really on an individual level by all of us, then this is a trend that is unfortunately going to continue. Now, in terms of some of the things related to the question on hybrid work and flexible work, and whether it's working or not, I'd agree with Emma that we've spent years trying to make flexible work, and it hasn't. So I think the silver lining with the pandemic has, of course, been, as we all recognize, the fact that it's forced us all to work flexibly, to work remotely. And the corollary from that has been that the mental models around who needs flexibility have modified somewhat. It's no longer the case that we're thinking that it's only women who have children who need flexibility. We found that actually men really enjoy flexibility too, and are almost as loath as women to give it up now. Fathers have enjoyed spending time with their children. People across all genders have enjoyed just having time for themselves and saving time on an unnecessary commute, for instance, and even the costs involved with that. So that's certainly something that's positive that has come out of it. And I think we're all accepting the fact that the new normal in terms of what the workplace of the future will look like is definitely going to at least be hybrid in most organizations that are forward thinking. And in some cases, we've had very famous announcements. Airbnb have just come out and said it'll be entirely remote, with the occasional sort of meetup once in a while. In Singapore, which is relatively it's the heart of Asia, and flexible work has not been as popular as it has been even in the UK, for instance. We're also seeing some very interesting examples. We just had a law firm come out and say that they're actually going to let their people all work from home and just have what they call a monthly roll call, where people show up just to make sure that the social interaction is maintained and that networking element is sustained. So that those are some of the positives. I think another important positive that has come out of the pandemic has been a recognition of the need to change, grossly antiquated models of work. And Tessa, you and I were talking about this earlier. It's almost sort of post-war models of work, that haven't changed in decades. And the world we're living in today has changed so much in the last 2 years, forget in the last 50 years or so, and so many things desperately needed changing. And what the pandemic has done is it's forced some of these changes upon us. So I actually think that there's a great opportunity here if we're willing to take it. And just earlier today, it's 8 p.m. for me. So, this afternoon, I was having another discussion. I was speaking with HR leaders across the Asian region. And we were having this conversation around what are some of the challenges they're facing. And we concluded with exactly what I'm saying now, that there's actually an opportunity now to use what we've got, the situation we're in, this post-pandemic or pandemic normal, COVID normal sort of situation, to force some of those changes. Because leaders have had to accept the fact that, we can no longer expect employees to fit their entire lives around their work schedule. One of the trends that we talk about in terms of future of work now is that employees are more empowered today than they have been in the past. Not the least because of the great resignation and the fact that we're all desperately trying to attract and retain employees. And as a result, what's happening now is that companies are therefore being forced to look at what are some of the changes we need to make so that we can make flexible work, hybrid working actually work and work for everyone. To the point that Emma was making earlier, and from what I saw from the Deloitte survey, the fact that it is not working right now, and a lot more work has to be done to make that hybrid working scenario actually function. So one of the things that, if I may just have a couple of minutes to talk about another survey that we did, pre-pandemic now, there was, at that point, we had a lot of discussions around the fact that, well, there's so many measures have been introduced for greater diversity, greater gender diversity, and but they don't seem to be working. So what's going wrong? So we had, before the pandemic, at the INSEAD Emerging Markets Institute, done a survey that, again, went across many different countries, involved, I think we had almost 30,000 respondents. And the questions that we asked them about were basically to understand from women and men and for other genders to tell us about, what are some of the things that they find worked in their leadership journeys and what are some of the problems that they had. And we spoke to people at different levels in sort of their leadership journey. And the three things that stood out for me, and forgive me, I work with a business school, we love our acronyms, so I'm going to use one now. So the three things that stood out are what I call SAD, sad state of affairs. And the reason for the sad state of affairs, the S is a lack of specificity in terms of, what are the measures that have been introduced supposed to address? What are the specific problems that they are supposed to address? And who decided that these were problems that need addressing? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. That's fine.
Okay, I sort of suddenly lost the screen. Okay, I'm back again. So that was about specificity. The second one that stood out was a lack of accountability. I always say if heads don't roll when, targets are not met, then the targets become quite useless. We won't use the dreaded Q word, but at least very firm targets. And that's something that I'm seeing. I feel a little optimistic because I do see that there are some changes being made these days to sort of let that happen. And the final one was in terms of disclosure, D. The idea of, telling us exactly what are the steps that have been taken to increase the pipeline of women who are being sort of brought into leadership areas. I'm constantly being told, we're desperately trying to add more women to our board and we just don't have enough people. And so I make suggestions, I'll send them 10 names. And then when I check later as to what happened, and they'll say, well, they were excellent. They had great qualifications and capabilities, but they just don't have, relevant experience. And I keep telling them, don't waste my time and yours because, we don't have that many women leaders. And that's exactly what the problem is. So as long as if we're going to keep thinking that someone who's done exactly that same job elsewhere is the person we want, we're not going to get them. But if we focus on skills and capabilities as opposed to exactly the same experience elsewhere, then we might be able to make that change. So, and I think that hasn't changed. So what came out of that survey continues to stay today also. The one thing that has, again, has sort of increased and has become an additional point to that is this impetus to change those antiquated models of work and, bring in the change that we've been wanting for so long.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I love an acronym, so I'm here for you for that. but one thing I just want to kind of draw us into is how things change. And I think that we can spend a chunk of today, and it will be really useful to look at how organizations actually embed that accountability, the transparency, the culture shift. I think if we just loop back very quickly, and I really want to hear people's views in the chat about this. If the standout sort of statistic was the level of burnout, Emma, and we can create supportive environments, but if the balance of caring and work doesn't shift outside of work, are we always going to be sort of fighting an uphill battle in work? And I'd love to hear from people, sort of in about their experiences in the last 2 years about where the kind of caregiving burden has landed. Because I know, queen of anecdote here, I know for some people, the whole burden of homeschooling, caring, plus work fell on them. For other people, it was a transformational time where actually, there was a real partnership and care got split out within a family in a fairer way. So I'd love to, I'm just putting that out there because I'd like to come back to Emma about Vinika's points about this sort of transparency and accountability and how you actually affect change within organizations. But I will be bringing people in from the chat about sort of their experiences the last couple of years, if that's okay. And I'd like to come to Anushka Sharma at some point, because I love that phrase that domestic cognition is a thing, and I'd like to understand that a bit more. But Emma, taking Vinika's points about you put the structures, you have specificity, can't say that word, accountability and disclosure. You have the metrics, you have the measurements, you have the framework, but how do you make a culture change? How do you actually pull the levers within an organization?
Well, it's sort of, as Vinika said, I loved what she said and I love the SAD acronym as well. It is around, if I look at my own organization, first of all, it's recognizing you've got a problem in the first place. And how do you do that? Well, I'm a big fan of storytelling, of making it real and combining that with show me the money and showing the financial, and I know many of us, it's depressing thinking, we're beyond business case. Of course we're beyond business case. But actually, like with anything you're trying to change, you need to show the financial impact of getting this wrong. And so, in my old UK role, we calculated the cost of replacement of everybody, actually mainly women, that we'd lost in one financial year due to work-life balance and culture. And that gave me a very big number that I was then able to use in conversations with people that I felt still didn't quite get it. And you can try the sort of human argument and all the logic, but actually, so it's both of those. So it's first of all creating that, getting people to really realize this is a challenge. And there were many things that we were seeing from a data point. I like data to back things up, and we were able to see that as well. And then it was, for us, it was figuring out that actually a part of it was around, our everyday culture, around, the experiences that people had, and that how did we bring about that change? And that was a big education, not an unconscious bias, not anything. That was literally a conversation about, making sure the environment was always inclusive. And then there were interventions that we had. So I saw some of the comments in the chat, I think, earlier on about the systems that are in place and, and how they're designed and the sort of the gendered, element of that. And actually what we realized that when we pulled apart, we looked at every single system in recruitment, promotion, all of those things, and then had to be willing to say, right, we're going to have to change these because we know what we know, and why wouldn't we change them? And then I'd say finally, Vinika is spot on about the accountability and about targets. So we had targets. It's one thing to have them. It's another thing to then actually, take accountability for delivering against those. I'm a big fan of targets. I'm a big fan of gender pay gap reporting. We reported it early, and we did that for a reason. And so it's all of these things, go to bringing about change. And I think real accountability, everyday culture to me is so important. Your everyday experience is not what's on the posters. It's what you experience that's important. And I think that's a big part of what we're seeing with the Great Resignation. I look at all my friends who are having big career changes, rarely about pay. It's more about, you know what, I'm just not doing this anymore, and I'm going to go somewhere where I actually get, more fulfilled, and so you and therefore as employers we've got to recognize that, and we've got to work towards, it, and better engagement, and it means better productivity, means more successful business anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to bring Anushka in, if that's okay. Anushka, are you ready for us?
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Hi, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Can you explain what that means, domestic?
So in the past sort of year or so, I've been part of many women-oriented community networks, and we've been talking about this kind of gender divide, but also the divide in income. And really one of the things is this load of domestic cognition, where you're loaded up to do all the tasks that you have to do as a single parent, as a carer of elders, just doing stuff around the home if you're living with your partner that you naturally do, that you just do because perhaps we've just been taught that way, conditioned that way. And there was a great article about the Say No Club, which started when 4 professional women got together and they realized they were doing domestic housework. So all those things like watering plants, arranging cake for someone's birthday. Has everyone signed the card? I know I've definitely been part of that machine, and it's only since I became self-employed. I pivoted during the pandemic, so I now work 3 days a week in academia, and part of my role is actually taking technical minutes. And I don't mind that because that's the role that I have to do. But it's a very masculine environment, and I am sometimes the only woman and the only woman of color in that room. But part of my role is understanding what the technical restrictions might be for something in the future. So it's in my best interest to get the knowledge and minute it. But there is something quite jarring when you're negotiating the tasks that you want to do, particularly when you're remote working. And I think this is why this conversation right now is so important, because the dynamic is changing. But even by working part-time, I'm working pro rata. So I'm earning less in my part-time role than I did 10 years ago. And that's kind of shocking, because in my space career, I'm able to negotiate ridiculous fees for speaking or consulting and what have you. But I also have to do that work just to bump up my income to be where I want to be. And so it allows me to be flexible with my caring responsibilities and all those other things. But the domestic cognition and the load, that never goes away for a woman.
Yeah, I know. By the way, I just aspire to be able to say my space career at some point. And that is the coolest thing. I mean, you do have an incredibly cool career. And also on that caring thing, I was thinking, I'm pretty sure last time I looked that caring wasn't a hormone, and I wasn't born with it. I'm pretty sure it's a learned behavior from my mother and my grandmother. So, I think that we can shift the balance on that a bit. I was also reminded, do you remember that brilliant 1975 strike in Iceland, when 90% of women went on strike for a day in October in 1975 in Iceland, and the whole country ground to a halt? And they say that was the sort of when it opened the floodgates for this incredible sort of equality and representation at a political level in Iceland. Anyway, I'm not suggesting we all go on strike. I am suggesting we all go on strike. I would like to bring in, if I may, Helen, who I think is on a train. So I don't know what the sound quality is going to be like. But Helen, are you there? And where are you hurtling off to, Helen?
I am here, and I'm hurtling off the train at Dulwich, so I don't get cut off. Apologies. Yes, I was making the stat that we've worked out that the cost, just pure replacement costs for an average 5,000 FTE company, is $250,000 a year in the women they will lose who don't return to work after, when they come back after maternity leave. But nearly
can you just unpick that for me? So,
yeah.
So the replacement cost of a woman who loses £250,000 in the. So does that take into account? So what goes into that figure, like the cost of training them, recruiting them, that you basically lost that sunk cost in the woman?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are actually based on Deloitte's figures. So Deloitte average out replacement costs are between 75 and 150%. Your recruitment fees, your cost of training, onboarding, lost productivity, all of those costs. When you look across an organization, and presuming you have a 50-50 split of men and women, which is still not quite the case in a lot of organizations, 1 in 5 women will leave the workplace entirely within 5 years of having a baby. And only 20% of women will come back full time after having a baby. So if you look at the 1 in 5 number leaving the workforce entirely, you look at the costs to replace them, you look at the salary, including the pay gap, and that's the average salary of kind of a 50, 60,000 employee. You're annualizing that at 250,000 a year, only in sheer costs of replacement, nothing else like top line contribution, building inclusive environments, anything like that. It's just a sheer bottom line cost.
Wow, Helen, that is fascinating. Emma, is that something you recognise from when you talked about being able to present the data and, the costs? Does that resonate with what you've experienced?
Yeah, and that was, I think, Helen referred to. I mean, we shared our our methodology on cost of replacement with various organisations, because it's not an exact science, but Helen's right. It is a huge amount. So for us, with the attrition we had in one financial year, and this was just at 2 grades, the sort of mid-level grades for us, the total was a 68 million pounds that I always say we were opening the window and letting it fly out, because that was the reality. And that was just for people that we were losing as a result of work-life balance and culture. And many of those, to Helen's point, were women who were returning, women who were carers. So yeah, that's why it's so important to show that, because I just don't think anyone has any comprehension. I think they just think, I employ this person, they go, oh well, they've gone. No, what's walking out of the door is years of experience, investment, and for you to then rebuild that again is enormous. And why would you? For the sake of just changing the way you work.
And Vinika, can you share the bit of the conversation we had about the lattice yesterday? Because that sort of relates, doesn't it, to this sort of, well, I'll let you explain it better than I can paraphrase it.
So that wasn't actually my term, Tessa, but I mean, I can sort of, I think I might know what you're talking about. I'm happy to sort of.
Emma, was it you? Am I getting confused in my conversations? Emma, is it you?
It was me, and I'll be really quick.
This is what a national shortage of HRT looks like, by the way, in case anyone wants to know.
I feel it. So all it is, and I'm sure Vinika, you have a sort of similar view on it, is just the fact that careers don't have to be that way. They can be up and a bit to the side, and then up and a bit around, and I think we've just always got this sort of mindset that's very much driven on we must advance at all times. Now, there are fundamentals that I would have expected in any role that I've ever had: recognition, fair treatment, all of those things. And there are things that are important to me about the roles that I've taken. But in my career, I've sort of done that, and then a bit to the side, and then that, and that's retained me. But I think I'm unusual in that I've had people that have enabled me to do that without judgment, and that have enabled me, to feel comfortable with that. I don't think that's typical.
Okay. And Vinika, just very quickly, I know we did talk about this, it's not all complete brain fog over here, about bringing people back, getting people back on the ramp, and how organizations do that successfully. What have you seen in your travels that really works there?
Yeah, so when we talk about what are the problems that women face coming back, we talk about the idea of a systemic web of challenges, and these are two of my colleagues at INSEAD, Pettiglery and Kinias, who've done a lot of research on this. And the conversations about the fact that there's no one problem, there are a whole lot of different problems, some of which have already been mentioned, by Emma and yourself, and also I see a lot of different things being mentioned in the chat. So whether it's about the gender pay gap that we spoke about, or biases, conscious and unconscious. I don't know how anyone can still be unconscious about biases with all the training that we're having, but there are those instances, or it's just lack of sort of networks that people have. And then there are also organizational policies and practices which are unfair to women, and these are things that have built up over years. So there's a whole web of challenges, and so to counter that web, we talk about a systemic set of solutions. Then so it has to be a nuanced approach that you take. And one of the, again, positives of the pandemic has been the fact that, because the lines between work and home have been been blurred so much. We've all, those of us who are, team leaders or organizational sort of heads, etc., have become conscious of the home situations of our colleagues. Whether it's because, a child has had to be, homeschooled while we were having a conversation, or as always happens in my case, my dog barks at the wrong time, etc. You get a sense of who lives in what kind of house and what are some of their domestic issues. Is there a partner who's supportive? Are they, responsible for the dreaded second shift and doing everything at home too, etc. And so that is sort of, I think it's created in us the sensitivity to the fact, and I speak to organizational leaders who talk about this, that suddenly they've become aware of the fact that their colleagues and their subordinates especially do have a personal life, and therefore a more flexible approach based on something nuanced, which is almost somewhat customized to the needs of individuals, as opposed to one size fits all policy. There used to be policies that for us in Asia would come from North America, and the expectation was it would work. Fortunately, that part, at least, people are recognizing that within Asia we have countries that feel like continents, and so you can't really do that. But besides that, so taking that sort of nuanced approach is very important. But one of the things that I remember a senior manager here told me was the idea that a woman who has a gender balancing foundation that starts at home is invariably more productive at work, because it's just that there are people in the house who recognize the importance of her job and the contribution that she's making, both in the workplace and through her contribution to that second shift at home. So those are some of the things that we try and emphasize. Another thing that's very important, and that's again a trend that we're seeing, is the need for skills retraining for the future. So the idea of what we call lifelong learning. The recognition that everyone of all genders is going to require constant training as we go along, because even as we teach an MBA program or any program that we're talking about, by the time you've gone through 1 year of training, a lot of what you started learning is already obsolete, because the pace of change is so fast. So the need to constantly upskill the workforce, the recognition that we do that, I think that goes a long way actually in making people feel comfortable if they've been away for a bit.
Yeah, but actually everybody's always learning, and you're not just the one having to kind of learn new things, because that's happening. And that gets back to Emma's zigzag point, doesn't it? You tack and you change and you adjust. I'm very excited. I think we may actually have a male voice in the conversation. Andrew, can we go to Andrew Girdwood, who's hello, representing half the population? Andrew, no pressure.
And I'm very conscious of the fact that really I should just shut up and listen.
No, absolutely not, because this isn't a woman's problem. It's not.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, carry on.
Let's cut you off, didn't I? I was speaking up in chat because I was recognizing what I think of as the emotional burden. And that is nobody else is doing it, I better. And that's, I think the examples were, arranging cakes and picking up the washing and doing that sort of thing. And men are just, sort of anecdotally, in my experience, circle of friends stuff, just happier to let things slide for longer. And I think, Tessa, you made that point, that can't be hormonal, that can't be biology that does that. That has to be a learned thing, that has to be a cultural thing. And if that happens at home, imagine what it's like at work. I think the same thing happens. So previously we had the point about how women weren't given the opportunity to be senior managers because maybe they had the interview, but they didn't have the same level of experience. I think that's so unfair, because for a woman to even be in that seat, being interviewed in the first place, they've had far few opportunities to get that far, and will have had to work twice as hard probably as some of the male candidates. So I think men have to recognize that. And I know it's a slightly pejorative term, but there's a positive discrimination. But I think I need a better phrase, but proactively say, look, those two candidates look similar, but I recognize that she's probably is much better because they look similar.
And have you seen, again, queen of anecdote, or anecdata, as I like to call it, have you seen a shift in your workplace, in your groups of friends? Do you think things have changed in the last couple of years, in the sense that there is either a recognition of how these roles have sort of been entrenched or even unnoticed, and all things changing?
Yes, but not in the way I would like. I think women are far more aware of it. I think men still have their head stuck in the sand. That not all men, not me thing seems to be endemic. Other guys think like that, but I don't.
Okay, so you can be organising the Scottish branch of the national strike then. Okay, excellent. Well done, Andrew. Thanks so much for contributing. Now we're going to come to. I hope have we got Naomi ready to go, Lizzie? Yeah, can we hear from Naomi, who's been making some great points in the chat as well?
Hi. I've been making lots of points. So I don't know if you've got anything you're particularly interested in.
Top three.
Okay, so I think one of them is maybe picking up a little bit on the emotional load, and I've just been thinking. So my husband and I, it's not always very equal at home. And I think partly I think we have to level the playing field. And what I mean by this, I've seen some comments in the chat about like 4-day work weeks and stuff. I think in the same way that shared like paternity, paternity leave, encouraging men to take time off, I think unless the standards of success for everybody change, almost we wrap it back, we can't necessarily make men change their behaviors to be more like women, but if the system changes so that actually we all do a bit less, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are for that, then that sort of levels the playing field in one sense. And
when you say that, do you mean sort of that it's as acceptable for men to work flexibly as it is for women? Do you think it starts at school? I
think it starts early, but I mean, in terms of course correction later on down the line, if suddenly 4-day weeks were a thing, for argument's sake, then we all do less, and otherwise you're waiting for men to decide. You can have a flexible working policy and it's open and encouraged for men, but in the similar sort of targets, what's the benefit for them of it? I mean, some are enjoying it, so I'm almost coming from if we just level the playing field for everybody by saying we do 4-day weeks now, could that help?
What I'm seeing a lot of in the chat, and Naomi, I love your idea. I think I'm totally here for it. But what I'm hearing in the chat, and actually what sort of some of this research is showing, is that a lot of people seem to have traded 20% of their salary for a bit of flexibility whilst doing 100% of their job.
Yeah.
And that's, I know my career, that's what I did. Mm-hmm. I traded 10% of my salary just to be able to do one morning drop off when I was in the city. So I know that just feeling like you've got the ability to push back a tiny bit or have a tiny bit of autonomy is disproportionately priced, as it were, in terms of salary. So, I mean, and I don't make sweeping generalizations, but I do worry with that extra day, it might just be another round of golf. Anyway, making a sweeping generalization, do please jump in, any other men. I'm looking at you, Ed Davison, James Love, at any point if you want to come in and defend your sex. But coming back to the Great Resignation, which is our original question, we should round back to it at some point. I had a little sort of, with my love of punning, think about that today, because there are two things here. One, the Great Resignation, that women vote with their feet, they go to the organisations that give them an environment in which they can thrive, support them over the long term. And I really, I still think the kind of research is quite embryonic, I think, don't you think, Emma, in terms of whether that's really happening? And then the flip side of that is the Great Resignation, which is we just accept so much of this. And that's the other thing that's really got to change. We have not got to be resigned to the way in which so many people live and work. And I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that a lot of people have choices about where they work, may find themselves going to better organisation. There are an awful lot of people who don't have the luxury of being, what is considered talent as opposed to labour. And again, looking at the sort of demographics of the women we're talking about, there are an awful lot of women who aren't in a position to lift and move into other jobs for various reasons. So, Emma, what do you think, if we were going to ask ourselves this question in 5 years' time, what do you think it will look like by then? Or, what do you hope it will look like by then?
What, in terms of the
travel of women within, in terms of if we think there's a Great Resignation to go and work, either just to give up on work or to go and find places that are better suited to supporting people in their lives. What does your vision of in 5 years' time look like?
Well, I think, look, I've got two possible streams that could happen. One, which is that you will continue to see women either dropping out of the workforce entirely or retraining for a different career that actually gives them a better work life. And I will say success, because I loved what, I think it was Naomi or somebody was saying in the chat, I really loved that term of, sort of success on, in both areas. So look, that could happen. Or you could have companies, I think, that actually sit up, read this and other great bits of research like the INSEAD one, like, some of the stuff that you've seen in the chat, and just realize what the secret sauce is, basically. And I do think that we consistently read these pieces of research and we consistently, seek to understand what is it, but actually the answer is often there. And I mean, in our data, we've a small number of women that work for these leading organizations, so 5% of the women we spoke to, but each of them had these things in common. So, it was around inclusive culture. It was around supported on work-life balance, feeling completely supported, around progression. But then the data itself is incredible in terms of the difference.
Yeah.
So when you look at their retention, their mental health, do they feel excluded in hybrid? Generally not. What about flexible working? And that's why I like data, because you can't really argue with it. So look, you've got, there's two routes here. And I really hope in both those routes that in the home, we do manage to change the balance of care, because that is, I totally agree with the mental load. That's the problem I have in my home. And yet, I do all this work on gender balance and I haven't managed to achieve that in my own home. So we need to fix what's going on in outside work, caring and wider home responsibilities. And then we can choose as employers.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. There was a question from Katie Driver, or a point from Katie. Katie, are you there? Can we come to you? Yes, no?
Hello.
Hi, where are you?
Hi, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. Hi. Sorry to pounce on you. But you were making a point about whether there's a sector differential. Or you can make your own point, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I was just conscious that it sounded to me as though quite a lot of the frame of the conversation so far is geared towards kind of a professional woman who has the ability to choose, if she wanted to, perhaps to go to a different employer or switch career or whatever. And there's an awful lot still to go with that. But I'm also mindful that so many women are in really, frankly, crappy jobs, very low paid jobs, or jobs that they love, but which are very poorly paid and poorly respected. And how much is going on in that space to enable them to feel kind of valued and worthwhile, so that the Great Resignation doesn't kind of continue out into those spaces too.
And without, I mean, you don't have to answer this, but, at the end of sort of the pandemic and in the new normal working environment, how's it working for you? Have there been changes in your life?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I'm self-employed. I work from home most of the time. My husband is in and out of the office, but has been working full time, although he does 4 days a week. So in some respects, I'm very lucky, but I'm mindful that on his day off, I'm kind of thinking, oh, well, has he done this? Has he done that? The mental load is still kind of ticking over. And certainly the people that I talk to, the women I talk to, are still struggling with, how do we manage a hybrid thing? What's going to be acceptable? How do I manage kind of the commute if it comes back in? Complicated childcare if you're in for kind of 2 days a week, all of those sorts of things, still very live and up in the air. And I was noticing someone in the chat saying people are pretending that the new policies are fixed in stone, and I really don't think they can be. So to the extent that we can play with things and see how they work, get the data, I think that's all going to be helpful.
Yeah, and I think I'd see it's coming up a couple of times in the chat. By the way, I'd really love to hear, I think Lizzie has mentioned it as well, if anybody has had a sort of, a really positive outcome or made the change and it is happy to share with us their great resignation or their great shift. I think that one of the things we haven't touched on when it comes to making work sustainable for women is the cost of childcare. And you know, and I think this is one of the really interesting kind of sort of lenses through which you look at things as a working family, which is that still I think a lot of people think of childcare as being allowing them to go and work rather than both their partners. And that may be me looking through a lens of having much older children, but it always felt to me that it was the price I paid to go to work. I mean, I'd love to hear from anyone in the chat who thinks that is. Oh, Katie's got her hand up. Katie Vanek Smith. Can we go to Katie?
Sure. Hello. I love your wallpaper, Tess. The thing that when you were just saying that about that sort of default setting that sort of I think has come up in lots of different ways, it reminded me of a thinking that I attended with Linda Grattan, and when Anne Cairns from MasterCard talked about what they've done at MasterCard being that they now have the same parental policy for men and women, and they haven't done it. And what they're doing is they're sort of encouraging and enforcing the men to take equal time off as the women, because what they're wanting to do is change that inbuilt culture that you know that as a woman in your late 20s and early 30s, that people are looking at you as a potential mother and therefore as a cost to the business. Versus, and actually, if you build that into the policies, what you begin to change is that view that anyone in their mid-20s to mid-30s is going to potentially be a parent and will carry the same cost to the business. It's everything. I think Emma started with this idea of the policies and the in practice. But when you put in a policy like that, I often know that, you know, it needs to be encouraged or maybe even mandated that people take that time, because otherwise you don't get the change that you're looking for, which is the point that I think is sort of in this anyway. But I was laughing around the kind of men, you know, picking up the load, and well done, Andrew, for being brave and speaking up as a man on the call. But it made me laugh. I was just laughing to myself, and then Liv, who's on the thinking, sent me a private message saying, "You've made me laugh," which is even in the home, where actually I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive husband. We both work. We have one child. We split the responsibility of the jobs to be done at home. And he plays to his strengths, which is OCD. So he likes to do the dishwasher and the washing and everything that's slightly organized, you know, that sort of stuff. And I organize the food and the calendar because I like to know what we're eating and control who we see, because it's like that's what I like doing. But I don't refer to them as chores, but he does. And that mindset piece alongside the mental load is just fascinating, because I'm like, they're not chores. They're just things that have to get done. And if you think about them as chores, you will, like I think Lucy Huberman said in the chat, push them out for 6 weeks. They'll always go to the bottom of your to-do list. And it's just, they have to be done. They're just life. We just need to do this stuff. Anyway,
thanks, Katie.
I will shut up.
Yeah, no, and I was just thinking about your point about sort of policies. You wouldn't let anyone in your team not use any of their holiday allowance all year, because that would be totally detrimental to their productivity and well-being. So maybe we kind of ought to think about it a bit like that. I'd really love to come to, we have Margaret in the chat has made a change during the last couple of years, which, hi, where are you? Oh, hi, Margaret.
Hi there.
Hi.
So I switched. I work in a university as an academic, and I made the switch about 5 or 6 years ago to working 4 longer days and having 1 day off. And I have to say it has been quite, in some respects, life-changing. Initially, it took me ages to negotiate it, because they said that academics don't get to do that. And I really just kept asking, because I needed to do it and I wanted to do it. And eventually they agreed. And I was smart enough to actually get my contract rewritten so that it almost set a precedent that, no, this is my contract and you can't just deviate from that. And what I now do is, so I work Monday to Thursday, and I work quite long days. So I work 10-hour days, so 8:30 till 6:30. But probably like most people on the call, I was working those sorts of hours anyway. I just wasn't getting paid for all of those extra hours. And so now what I do on Fridays, a couple of years ago when I first did it, I used to help with childcare with my sister's kids. I now do a voluntary type role that is related to work, but it gives me the option to have the time to do that when I'm only doing that and I'm not distracted by other work things.
It's created a sort of headspace for you to
absolutely,
do. Yeah. Okay.
But there's also, for me, and I've got a few colleagues in other universities who've done it over maybe the last year or so as a result of the pandemic and as a result of reflecting on what they want their life to look like and what they want their working life to look like. But for me, one of the highlights of most weeks is actually a Thursday evening at 6:30 when I put the out of office on. And it took a long time to learn not to look at my work emails on a Friday. But I did learn to do it. And so I feel as if I now have almost like I have taught myself to draw the line between them so that I have almost like this 3 days in the week when I can do anything else that I want to do. And I use the 4 days when I'm working really well, really productively, because I know that I'm going to have that time at the end of the week.
It sounds like yeah, I mean, so trying to avoid those burnout stats we saw in the report, that sounds like you found a way to do that. And the second thing is, I think we may well set boundaries, but we've got to manage our own boundaries if we're going to expect anyone else to do it. So that's, I mean, you have self-discipline on that out of office that I really admire. We've got just cut. Thank you so much for that. It's really good to hear something in practice, and also the fact you set a precedent that may well then benefit other people in your sector, which is brilliant. We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm very conscious that if there are any points in the chat people want to make in the last couple of minutes, do jump in. Vinika, I asked Emma earlier if in 5 years' time things are going to be sort of better or worse for women off the back of what we've learned on hybrid working. What's your view on that? And the question I love, and I asked you yesterday and gave you some time to think about, and if you had one lever, or a magic wand that was going to really help solve this problem in the next few years, what would it be?
Okay, so first question first. So actually, when I think of the great resignation, I've heard it referred to also as the great realization. The fact that we've realized, because we've had a minute to take a step back, stop our traveling, stop the daily commute, stop just going from organizing childcare, fixing our chores because we were forced to do it. We had the opportunity, all of us across genders, to take a step back and think about what we really want to do with our lives. So what is the purpose of doing what we're doing and running around in circles? And I actually think that was a huge positive in many ways. It's forced us to rethink a lot of things that otherwise we just never stopped back to think about. And so I'm going to sort of try and end this on an optimistic note and say that I think that while the great resignation is going to continue, certainly as the Deloitte survey also showed, for some time at least, the pace has already slowed down. Hopefully, if organizations can get their sort of act together in terms of doing what I will say in answer to your second question, in terms of the one thing that I would love to wave a magic wand and have happen is flexify or fail. So proper flexible work provided with a proper understanding of what does that mean. So not just making the salary less, but expecting the same. So actually organizing work around what flexible work should mean, set very clear expectations and pay fairly. If that can happen, then I think that and a degree of trust. I think that's very important. The point about creating a culture of trust and realizing that you hired rational adults that hopefully you can trust to manage their own workload well and trust them to do it with a level of ethics that will not require so much control. Then we have a positive future ahead, I think.
Oh, I thank you for ending on a positive note. That's what we love, a bit of optimism at Tortoise. I'd like to thank Emma and Vinika so much for joining us, for all the brilliant sort of insight. I mean, we're supposed to try to summarize these conversations. We covered a lot of ground, but in very, very brief terms, I think we've heard that, as we know, with any change that happens, you've got to measure it, you've got to make people accountable for it, you've got to be specific about what you're really trying to achieve. And a point that Vinika made to me yesterday is, you've got to listen to the people who want the change, not tell them what they need. So I think we've heard a lot in the chat today about what people need. We've got some brilliant ideas and experience in the conversation that I certainly take away. And I just would like to thank everybody who's been on the call today for being so generous in sharing your views, joining us today. I hope we all go with a slight spring in our steps. My out of office is going to go on hard, and I'm not going to look at emails over the weekend. Go me. Thank you so much. Hope to see you all at we've got Wills and Harry tonight. Team Wills, Team Harry, don't know, come along at 6:30 and tell us. And as everybody knows, we love a bit of a royal thinking at Tortoise. So do come and join us this evening if you'd like to. And thanks again to everybody for joining us today. Take care.